Welcome back to our channel. Today we'll delve into a story of a woman whose name still intrigues and mystifies historians and curious minds alike. Lady Castlerosse, often known by her maiden name, Doris Delevingne. If you haven't heard of her, don't worry, you're not alone. She was once one of the most talked about socialites of London, a figure whose beauty, daring, and connections could dazzle the room. Then she faded into a sort of historical footnote. But as we dust off the stories of her life, we uncover complexities, triumphs, tragedies, and controversies far more fascinating than any fiction. Before we begin, picture the scene. The lavish ballrooms filled with swirling dancers in shimmering gowns, the snapping of camera flash bulbs as the press flocked to capture the latest it girls, champagne flowing freely amid an air of rebellious glee. This was not the stiff-lipped Victorian era. It was a vibrant new age. Beneath all the glitter, however, old money values clashed with modern freedoms. Secrecy danced with exposure, and somewhere in the midst of it all stood Doris, clever, charming, ambitious, and occasionally reckless. She mixed with aristocrats, future prime ministers, even the occasional Hollywood luminary. Hers is a story of reinvention, heartbreak, scandal, and profound influence, one that would ultimately shape the trajectory of not only her own life, but the reputations of some very powerful individuals. Let's first transport ourselves to England in the early 1900s. The world was perched on the brink of monumental change. Queen Victoria had passed away in 1901, bringing an end to the iconic Victorian era that had shaped Britain for the better part of a century. But if that era was about decorum, caution, and rigid social mores, the new century was poised to break open with fresh possibilities. By the 1920s, the Edwardian period gave way to a post-World War I sensibility. People sought refuge in glamour and celebration, even if only to forget the devastation of war. Soldiers returned from the front lines feeling disillusioned, but society's elite found fresh impetus to flaunt their fortunes in jazz-infused soirees. It was a time defined by the clash between tradition and modernity, airplanes buzzing overhead, the rhythms of jazz sweeping across dance floors, and flappers defying old-fashioned expectations with bobbed hair, shorter skirts, and spirited independence. Women were fighting for the right to vote, while newspapers were filling with stories of daring aristocrats who raced cars, flew planes, or smoked cigarettes in public. London, in particular, thrummed with this sense of reinvention. Everyone was seeking a bit of novelty, some new thrill that might capture their imaginations and quell the lingering memory of all that was lost in the war. But despite the modernization swirling around them, the British upper classes still held tight to the concept of inherited privilege. Titles, land, and wealth passed from generation to generation, ensuring that the right families remained entrenched in society's highest ranks. Social climbers might try to break through, but these established circles didn't readily accept newcomers, unless, of course, those newcomers possessed exceptional allure or cunning. Enter Doris Delevingne, who would one day become Lady Castlerosse. She was born in 1900, right on the cusp of this transformation, and she would embody the remarkable shift of a generation who embraced the roaring 1920s. She was no aristocrat at birth, but she knew how to fit in with them, and sometimes how to outshine them. What was it like to be a young woman coming of age in that period? Doors were beginning to open for women, though lingering old-fashioned attitudes still limited their freedoms. Yet there was a sense of exhilarating possibility for someone bold enough to grab hold of modern life. Doris, known even in childhood for her vivacious personality, was the kind of person who wanted to test boundaries, who believed that life offered more than just polite drawing room tea. She watched the older generations cling to their stuffy traditions and felt compelled to seek out her own path. Those who knew her in her adolescence saw that she was not content merely to be an onlooker at society's grand events. She wanted to be the star of the show. Even in her early teens, she developed a talent for forging connections, striking up conversations with wealthier acquaintances, employing her sparkling wit, and ensuring that she was in the right place at the right time. Through her resourcefulness and charm, she gained invitations to exclusive gatherings, the sort of parties where aristocratic youth were pushing social boundaries under the watchful eyes of chaperones who were not quite sure how to handle this spirited new generation. It was in that swirl of after-war parties and bohemian clubs that Doris honed her gift for social maneuvering. She was especially clever in reading people's desires. An apt listener, she learned what made others tick, the kind of flattery that could bend the proud, the thrill-seeking that could tempt the bored, the witty remarks that could fascinate the well-read. This social intelligence became a passport of sorts, an essential tool for a woman determined to ascend the ranks of elite society. But long before she became a fixture of tabloids and gossip columns, Doris Delevingne was just a girl from a family with moderate means. Some say they were less than stable financially, though they had the advantage of certain connections. She wasn't titled, she wasn't born to a prominent family, but she understood that in London's high society, charisma could be just as valuable as a noble pedigree. The 1920s roared into motion, and Doris roared with them. The city's social scene was enthralled by the so-called bright young things, a group of aristocrats, artists, and bohemians known for their flamboyant behavior, costume parties, and irreverent treatment of the older generation's prudish codes. Doris soon found herself firmly entrenched in this crowd, weaving in and out of friendships and flirtations with other bright young people who valued eccentricity and hedonism. She had the looks and she had the zest to be at the heart of it all. Now for some, the bright young things were synonymous with lazy aristocrats wasting time on endless parties. But they were also recognized as a moment of cultural rebelliousness and creativity, capturing imaginations with their desire to push away from the gloom of war. Doris fit right into that narrative, an emblem of a generation seeking life, color, and excitement. It was also in this heyday of wild parties and champagne-fueled nights that Doris's love life took on center stage. She was known to enchant men of influence, from wealthy heirs to established noblemen. Her flirtations weren't just personal amusements, they were stepping stones in a larger climb, and her ascent caught the attention of not just the British press, but even some corners of continental Europe where tales of the scandalous, free-spirited London socialites occasionally made headlines. By 1928, at about age 28, she had something that many young women of her circle dreamed of. She had married into the aristocracy. Her husband, Valentine Brown, was Viscount Castlerosse, part of a line that included the Earls of Kenmare. Through this marriage, Doris secured a title that would transform her social status from a well-liked social climber to a legitimate member of the aristocracy. This transition from Doris Delevingne to Lady Castlerosse was perhaps the crowning achievement of her early ambitions. But it was just the beginning of the real story, because once she became Lady Castlerosse, she was more determined than ever to remain center stage. Viscount Castlerosse was charming but carried his own complexities. He was a journalist and socialite who contributed to newspapers. He had his own circle of connections and a penchant for high living. Their marriage was described by onlookers as captivating from the outside, two flamboyant personalities, both with a keen sense of style. They were a couple that turned heads at every ball, dinner party, or weekend retreat. But behind closed doors, rumors flew. Their relationship was said to be tempestuous, fueled by the highs of public adoration and the lows of arguments and jealousy. The marriage gave Doris the social standing she craved, yet it also exposed her to new kinds of gossip and scrutiny. You see, in the aristocratic circles of the time, extramarital liaisons weren't exactly unheard of. Many couples locked in marriages of convenience led separate romantic lives behind the scenes. Still, there was an etiquette to these affairs. Discretion was prized. But Doris's name soon appeared in gossip columns, often with bold hints that she might be seeing men who were not her husband. Some said it was an open secret. Others claimed it was malicious rumor. Whether or not she was faithful to Viscount Castlerosse, her public image began to revolve around her scintillating relationships and rumored affairs. She lived in that curious space where scandal could feed one's celebrity, but also exact a personal cost over time. One of the most sensational claims about Doris was her association with Winston Churchill. Yes, that Winston Churchill, the statesman who would one day guide Britain through World War II, admired by many for his leadership and oratory. During the interwar years, Churchill was still navigating political ups and downs, sometimes in government, sometimes out. The rumor mill insists that Doris and Churchill had a kind of friendship, perhaps more, that involved discreet meetings and shared confidences. Some accounts even suggest that Churchill, an enthusiastic painter, produced at least one portrait of Doris, capturing her striking features on canvas. It sounds like the stuff of a salacious novel, an ambitious socialite, and a rising political giant entangled in a secret fling. Yet the historical record remains somewhat patchy. Diaries, letters, and secondhand recollections swirl around, leaving behind a cloud of speculation. Churchill was married, of course, to the formidable Clementine, and his personal life was heavily guarded by those close to him. At the time, any scandal involving Churchill would have carried enormous stakes, not just for him, but for the political landscape of Britain. Rumor has it that Doris may have preserved that portrait, or even used it as leverage to remain in Churchill's good graces, though definitive proof is elusive. What we do know is that Churchill's circle acknowledged Doris's presence and recognized that she had a certain hold over him, or at least enough of a relationship that they worried about the potential for gossip to spiral. As the 1930s arrived, Lady Castlerosse was riding high among the aristocratic and celebrity set. She hosted parties in lavish apartments, traveled in style to the Riviera, mingled with Hollywood stars, and seemed unstoppable. It was the golden era of her life. Yet below the surface, tensions were building. The constant need to remain in the public eye, to maintain her lavish lifestyle, and to pay for her taste in high fashion began to weigh heavily. Although she had a title, money wasn't always free-flowing. Viscount Castlerosse had financial issues of his own, and the demands of the lifestyle Doris insisted on were steep. One observer of the time famously remarked that Doris will either dine with a king or not dine at all, reflecting her unwavering commitment to living large, no matter the cost. The friction within her marriage escalated, eventually leading to divorce in the mid-1930s. And though a modern viewer might shrug at such an outcome, divorce being relatively common nowadays, back then divorce, especially in the aristocracy, was a significant scandal. Lady Castlerosse did not shrink from it, though. She faced the courts, the gossip, and the public scrutiny head-on. Afterward, she was no longer tied to Viscount Castlerosse, but she continued to be known as Lady Castlerosse socially, clinging to the name and the status it conveyed. Titles had a certain magic, even if you were no longer wedded to their lineage. Despite the newly single status, her life was not suddenly carefree. Behind the glamorous facade, emotional struggles festered. Close friends commented that Doris occasionally expressed deep anxiety about her financial stability and about aging in a society that prized youthful beauty. During the darkest moments, she might have wondered whether all the fame and relationships had done anything to secure genuine happiness or lasting peace. Still, Lady Castlerosse pressed onward. She was never a woman to hide away in the countryside and nurse her wounds. She traveled frequently. She visited fashionable European destinations, the French Riviera, Venice, Monte Carlo, and kept company with wealthy businessmen and European nobility who were similarly seeking respite from the complexities of life. At times, it seemed like she was living a dream, sun-drenched days on private yachts, evenings spent glittering in ball gowns. In these fleeting moments, she was the queen of her own domain, enjoying not just the attention of admirers, but also the envy of other socialites. Yet as the 1930s came to a close, the ominous cloud of another world war began to form on Europe's horizon. Political tensions rose. The carefree soirees became tinged with worry as news from Germany and elsewhere suggested that the peace established after World War I was unraveling. Many British citizens, especially those in high society, had to make difficult choices about where to spend their time and money, and even about their allegiances. Some sought escape in the U.S. or in safe havens abroad. Some tried to remain in London, determined to keep calm and carry on, as the famous phrase would later say. For someone like Lady Castlerosse, whose life had been so heavily dependent on a network of wealthy acquaintances, changing times meant the possibility that her entire world might shift under her feet. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 brought new challenges and forced many socialites to adapt or face ruin. Society gatherings became fewer, overshadowed by the realities of war, rationing, blackouts, bomb raids. The glamorous parties gave way to more subdued gatherings or charitable engagements. Even for those with resources, life was simply not the same. It was during these war-torn years that Doris's fortunes took a downturn. Various accounts suggest that by 1940 and 1941, she found herself in a precarious financial position. She felt the pressing anxiety of bills to be paid, of acquaintances who might be less willing to fund her lavish tastes in the midst of global chaos. The transformations in British society made it harder for a woman whose primary claim to fame was an ability to enchant wealthy benefactors. As the bombs fell over London and families were torn apart, the extravagancies of the interwar period felt like a relic of a distant era. Still, Lady Castlerosse was not easily deterred. She traveled to the United States in the early 1940s, perhaps hoping to reconstruct a social world there. America, after all, had wealthy circles of its own, and some European exiles found it an alluring refuge from the war. Doris arrived with her usual style, hoping to leverage her British aristocratic charm to secure invitations and benefactors. Indeed, she managed to attend glamorous events and rub shoulders with Hollywood figures. Yet the American scene was not identical to London's. She was an intriguing figure, yes, but not necessarily the established social force she was back home. She might also have felt increasingly isolated. With Europe gripped by war, many of the old connections she had relied on were scattered or consumed by more pressing matters. Some aristocrats had stayed in Britain out of a sense of patriotic duty. Others had settled in safer enclaves of the Commonwealth. The swirling parties of Los Angeles or New York might have seemed shallow in comparison, or simply too unfamiliar. Doris found it challenging to regain her footing in a land where the title of lady did not carry the same weight it did in Britain. By 1942, Lady Castlerosse returned to London. Whether drawn back by a desire to see her home during wartime, or perhaps out of necessity, she arrived in a city that was drastically altered. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed by German bombing raids. Rationing and curfews were in full force. The glittering nightlife she once knew was subdued, replaced by a more somber acceptance of hardship. For someone whose entire adult identity had been wrapped up in the pursuit of social thrill, this London presented a harsh reality. Stories from friends and acquaintances in that final year paint a picture of a woman deeply troubled. She was still beautiful, still witty, but the spark that had once lit up 1,000 parties appeared to be dimming. Some said she was depressed. Others claimed she was anxious, perpetually worrying about her finances and her future. She may have had fleeting thoughts of forging a new path or stepping away from the limelight entirely, but the war overshadowed everything. And the public, dealing with the threat of invasion, the Blitz, and the heartbreak of lost loved ones, had little attention to spare for a socialite struggling to maintain her sense of purpose. Tragically, on December 12, 1942, Lady Castlerosse died in her hotel suite at the Dorchester in London under circumstances that are still not completely clear. The official cause reported was an accidental overdose of sleeping pills. Some whispered that it might have been a suicide, spurred by heartbreak, financial desperation, or some undisclosed emotional turmoil. Others maintained that it was purely accidental, that she'd had trouble sleeping and turned to medication. The truth remains elusive, tucked away in the shadows of history. Her death was sudden enough to shock the small circle of friends who still maintained contact with her. Society columns reported it in that restrained, almost perfunctory tone often reserved for tragic ends. But this was not the passing of a beloved public icon in the mold of a film star or political hero. Instead, it was the quiet end to a life that had once been the embodiment of glamour and flamboyance. Lady Castlerosse slipped from the world in the midst of a global conflict that overshadowed personal tragedy with a far vaster heartbreak of war. Yet for those who look closer, her story remains deeply intriguing, a symbol of an era that has long passed. She was a woman who redefined the possibilities for herself, forging a path from relative obscurity to the very peak of aristocratic society. She harnessed wit, charm, and courage to carve out a place in a world that wasn't exactly welcoming to newcomers. Her alliances, especially with powerful figures like Winston Churchill, speak to her undeniable magnetism. And while we'll likely never know all the details of those associations, they hint at a labyrinth of secrets, deals, and personal entanglements that shaped history from behind the scenes. One rarely discussed anecdote involves a friend who recalled that Doris, in her final year, felt tormented by the knowledge that her best years were behind her. She supposedly remarked that, "I've had the finest of everything, and where did it get me?" It's an unsettling quote, if it's indeed accurate, because it draws a sharp contrast to the usual image of Doris as the unstoppable social butterfly. It suggests that behind the bright lights and the extravagant dresses, there was a woman capable of introspection, perhaps regret about the fleeting nature of her success. The cameo appearances in diaries and letters also reflect a sadness that pervaded her later days, an awareness that she had soared so high and yet was left with intangible emptiness. If you take a moment to reflect on her life, it's tempting to see Lady Castlerosse as a cautionary tale about the perils of living for the approval of others. Indeed, she thrived on attention and adoration, building her empire of influence on the shaky foundation of public fascination. But we should also recognize her resilience, her bravery in challenging social norms, and her determination to seize an opportunity to ascend the rigid, class structures of her day. She was part of a generation of women breaking molds, testing freedoms. Despite her personal controversies, she exemplified a spirit of defiance against the slow-moving wheels of aristocratic tradition. History's controversies often revolve around her rumored involvement with Winston Churchill. Did they share a genuine romantic affair, or was it a platonic friendship that set society tongues wagging? Debate continues among historians. Some modern researchers have pointed to diaries and letters that hint at a strong emotional tie. If not a full-fledged affair, then certainly a closeness that troubled Churchill's inner circle. Others argue that such allegations are the product of a sensational rumor mill. Churchill, they note, was known to be quite protective of his female friends, helping them in times of financial need. So if Lady Castlerosse benefited from his generosity, perhaps that's all it was, a gesture of kindness. Then there's the debated existence of a nude or semi-nude portrait that Churchill painted of her. Certain tantalizing pieces of evidence suggest that Doris boasted about possessing a painting that could embarrass the future prime minister, but the actual painting has never definitively surfaced in the public domain. Some claim it was destroyed, others that it lies in a private collection. The idea of it, Churchill's brush, capturing Doris's figure in an intimate pose, is scandalous enough to stoke ongoing curiosity. While it remains unproven, the mere rumor has colored interpretations of both Churchill's personal life and Doris's skill at maintaining influence with powerful men. Yet the bigger historical significance of Lady Castlerosse doesn't hinge solely on this alleged painting, or even on the question of whether she was Churchill's mistress. It lies in what she represented, the intersection of old-world aristocracy and the new freedoms that emerged during the tumultuous early 20th century. She lived at a time when many women were pushing boundaries, stepping out of the domestic sphere and exploring their agency in public life. She tested those boundaries in her own way, employing her social intelligence as a stepping stone to the corridors of power. She was among the so-called bright young things, a cultural phenomenon that continues to fascinate scholars studying the shifting mores of interwar Britain. It's also fascinating to consider how her story parallels that of other notable female socialites of the 20th century, those who used their wits and presence to gain influence in otherwise exclusive circles. In an age where women's choices were limited, mastering the art of social climbing could be an effective if dangerous route to power. The risk lay in losing oneself among the illusions of status and the unpredictability of fleeting fame. And so we circle back to Lady Castlerosse's place in history, a figure simultaneously revered and reviled, pitied and envied. Today, her name might come up in books about interwar London or in genealogical research, particularly given that her Delevingne family line connects to modern figures in British pop culture. Occasionally, a hush of scandal arises when discussing her possible ties to Winston Churchill, but for decades she was largely relegated to footnotes, overshadowed by bigger events and bigger personalities. Only in recent years has there been a slight resurgence of interest, as historians seek to tell more nuanced stories of women in the 20th century, and as the Delevingne name finds renewed fame in the fashion and entertainment industries. If we glean one lasting lesson from Lady Castlerosse's life, it might be the peril of chasing illusions at the expense of genuine self-fulfillment. Doris Delevingne may have been the most sparkling hostess in the room, but the question remains, did she ever find the contentment she so desperately sought? Was it enough to be admired for her looks and her audacious style, or was a deeper personal meaning missing? For a moment, she seemed to have it all: a noble husband, the attention of powerful men, a seat at the exclusive high society table. But ephemeral achievements can slip through your fingers if they're not grounded in something more substantial than society's fickle approval. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.